A political career just died in broad daylight. No blood, no shouting, no chaos, just a calm voice, a few documents, and one woman who knew exactly where to strike. What happened inside the House of Commons wasn't debate, it was a public execution disguised as a Q&A. And Kemi Badenoch was holding the knife. It started like any ordinary parliamentary session, a few polite nods, murmurs from the benches, the Prime Minister ready to deliver his rehearsed answers. No one expected that within 15 minutes his credibility and authority and entire political image would collapse live on camera. But that's the thing about Kemi Badenoch. She doesn't raise her voice, she raises the stakes. At first the room didn't sense the danger. Her tone was respectful, calm, too calm. She began with a question that sounded almost routine. Why did the government fail to provide critical evidence in a collapsed national security case involving China? The Prime Minister smiled that politician smile. The one that says, I've handled tougher questions before, but this wasn't one of those days. Because Badenoch wasn't here to debate, she was here to detonate. Her words sliced through the chamber with surgical precision. She reminded the House that just 2 years ago, the UK government officially labelled China the biggest state-based threat to national security. That wasn't her opinion, that was written policy. So why, she asked, if everyone knew China was a threat, did the spy prosecution collapse like a house of cards? The Prime Minister fumbled, searching for a safe answer. He blamed the previous government, shrugged off responsibility and tried to sound composed. But the thing about evasion, it only works when the person questioning you doesn't have the receipts. Kemi did. She came with dates, documents and quotes. The kind that make politicians sweat. She reminded him that MI5 itself had called China a threat on record. If the evidence was solid, if the security agencies were alarmed, then who or what made the case suddenly fall apart? That's when the first cracks began to show. The Prime Minister's confident tone turned uncertain. He mumbled something about careful language and how previous leaders avoided calling China a direct enemy. Translation, we were scared to offend them. But Badenoch wasn't done. She fired back instantly. She quoted not just the opposition leader, but the Prime Minister himself, word for word, but where he had once admitted he shied away from calling China a threat. The entire chamber shifted. You could feel the temperature drop. Every MP leaned in, sensing that this was no ordinary question. This was a cross-examination, and the Prime Minister was the defendant. Badenoch had just exposed that both major parties had been soft on China, all while pretending to be tough in public. And now a spy case had collapsed under their watch. You could almost hear the unspoken words echoing through the room. Was this weakness or something worse? The Prime Minister tried to regain control, accusing her of taking his quote out of context, classic move, but Badenoch didn't blink. Her reply was ice cold. Those spies were charged under a Conservative government and released under Labour. You still haven't answered the question. That line hit like a hammer. No shouting, no chaos, just silence, the kind of silence that eats through power. Every camera, every journalist, every political aide knew what had just happened. In under 10 minutes, the Prime Minister looked less like a leader and more like a man cornered by his own words. But then Badenoch raised the stakes even higher. She mentioned a Sunday Times report, a secret meeting between senior officials and the National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, a meeting supposedly to discuss the spy case, conveniently behind closed doors. She didn't accuse directly, she simply asked, did it happen or did the Sunday Times invent it? The room froze. You could almost hear the Prime Minister's heartbeat. For a split second, he hesitated. That fatal political pause that tells you the answer is going to be bad. Then he admitted, yes, there was a meeting, but it did not involve any discussion of evidence. The words hung in the air like smoke. Really? A secret meeting about a collapsed spy trial? But somehow nobody talked about evidence. Does anyone in Britain believe that? And that's when it hit the room. This wasn't about one case or one Prime Minister. This was about something deeper. Power, secrecy and the illusion of control. Badenoch was peeling back layers as the government wanted sealed shut. By now, the Prime Minister was visibly unsettled, his answers turning defensive, his smile cracking. And Badenoch, she was just getting started. Because the next question, the one she was about to ask, would turn this quiet interrogation into a full-scale political autopsy. By the time the second round of questions began, the air in the House of Commons had changed. The chatter had vanished. Every pair of eyes was locked on Badenoch and the Prime Minister, as if the nation's political future hinged on what came next. And maybe it did, because what Badenoch said next wasn't just a question, it was an accusation wrapped in calm composure. She asked why the government claimed that only one man, the Deputy National Security Advisor, had full authority to make the decision that led to the case collapsing. One man, not the National Security Advisor himself, not the Home Secretary, not even Downing Street. The idea sounded absurd and everyone knew it. Even those sitting behind the Prime Minister started to shift uncomfortably. It was the kind of claim so unbelievable that it almost became proof in itself that something was being hidden. Badenoch pressed further, outlining the timeline like a prosecutor building her closing argument. The charges, she reminded the House, were filed in April 2024. The Crown Prosecution Service said the evidence was solid, the decision to charge was correct, and everything was moving forward. Then the new government came in and suddenly the case imploded. What changed between April and now? Her voice was steady, but her words were a blade cutting through layers of excuses. She wasn't asking for an opinion, she was asking for facts, the kind that leave a paper trail. The Prime Minister's reply was the same tired promise politicians give when cornered. Transparency, accountability, public trust. He assured Parliament he'd release the witness statements, the meeting minutes and all relevant correspondence. But of course, not today. He needed time, he said, to follow proper channels. Translation, delay, deflect and hope the story dies before the truth surfaces. The chamber wasn't buying it. You could see it in their faces. PS leaning back with raised brows, others whispering across benches. They'd seen this play before and it always ends the same way. The truth leaking out piece by piece until the damage is irreversible. But Badenoch wasn't giving him the luxury of time. She demanded the government release everything now, if there was nothing to hide. Her tone was sharp but restrained, a perfect balance of outrage and professionalism. If you have nothing to hide, she said, publish the evidence today. It was less a request and more a challenge. And the Prime Minister's refusal to meet it only made him look weaker. Every second he hesitated, every vague phrase he muttered, every deflection made it clearer. He was losing control of the narrative. That's when he made his biggest mistake of the day. In a moment of visible frustration, he tried to turn the attack personal. Perhaps the Honourable Lady is not a lawyer, he said with a smirk, nor a leader. The room erupted, gasps, shouts, murmurs, and even some on his own side winced. Personal insults in Parliament are nothing new, but they always carry a stench of desperation. It was the move of a man out of arguments, and Badenoch knew it. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't even flinch. Instead, she delivered the kind of line that ends careers. Forgive us if we don't trust a word he says. This is the same Prime Minister who stood by someone closely tied to a convicted paedophile. The room froze. No one breathed. That sentence landed like an explosion in a library. Every camera captured it. Every journalist scribbled it down. It wasn't just a punch. It was a knockout blow wrapped in calm diction. In that moment, the Prime Minister's authority evaporated. His face tightened. His aides looked panicked, and the chamber was buzzing with shock. Badenoch had shifted the tone from political critique to moral indictment. She had turned him from a head of government into a man under suspicion, not of a crime, but of a cover-up. And everyone watching knew that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Yet she wasn't finished. She laid out the final piece of her argument, accusing the government of hiding behind bureaucracy, blaming civil servants and using process as a shield against accountability. Her words echoed like a verdict. This all stinks of a cover-up. That single phrase would dominate headlines for days because once the word cover-up enters the public conversation, there's no going back. It implies guilt before evidence even surfaces. As she finished, the Prime Minister tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by shouts, jeers, and the chaotic hum of a chamber that had just witnessed political bloodshed. The damage was done. The story was written before he even opened his mouth. Badenoch had cornered him, stripped away his composure, and turned the entire debate into a courtroom drama with one clear villain. But there was still one question hanging in the air, one no one dared to ask out loud. If this case really collapsed because of one man's decision, then who was he protecting? Because in politics, no one acts alone. And the answer to that question would make the next part of this story far more explosive. By the time the whispers reached the press gallery, the question had already become a storm. Who exactly was the man the government claimed made the final decision to collapse the China spy case? It wasn't the National Security Advisor, not the Home Secretary, not a minister, just a deputy, a single unelected official with the power to override the intelligence agencies, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the will of Parliament. It sounded like fiction, but that was the official line. And if there's one thing politics teaches you, it's that the more unbelievable the story, the more likely it's hiding something very real. Badenoch, smelling blood, went straight for the jugular. She described the sequence like a crime novel. In April, MI5 and prosecutors declared the evidence solid. By June, meetings were happening behind closed doors. By July, the case had quietly fallen apart. And by August, government officials couldn't remember who said what or when. She wasn't just questioning, she was reconstructing a crime scene. Her tone stayed calm, but every word was a dagger, slicing through the fog of government jargon and ongoing investigations. The Prime Minister tried to intervene, repeating the same rehearsed line about respecting legal processes. And it was the kind of sentence designed to sound responsible while saying absolutely nothing. But Badenoch wasn't asking about law. She was asking about loyalty. She demanded to know whether this mysterious deputy national security advisor had acted alone or on orders. Who briefed him? Who approved his decision? And most importantly, why did no one in the cabinet seem to know what had happened until after the case was gone? Each question hit harder than the last. You could see it on the faces of MPs who just minutes earlier had been comfortably silent. Some shifted uneasily, others avoided eye contact as if afraid the next quote might expose something about them too. Badenoch wasn't just dismantling the Prime Minister's defence, she was dismantling the entire narrative of government competence. The phrase national security no longer sounded reassuring, it sounded incriminating. Then came the revelation that made the chamber gasp. Badenoch cited an internal memo leaked, she claimed, from within the cabinet office, showing that the decision to drop the spy case had been reviewed by at least 3 departments before it was finalised. 3 departments. That single document shattered the entire government narrative. It wasn't one man, it was a chain. And the moment you see the chain, you can start tracing who forged it. The Prime Minister's face said it all. The panic of a man realising the story he'd defended minutes ago no longer fit the facts. He stuttered, insisted that Badenoch was misinterpreting classified information, then pivoted to that classic political shield, national interest. Some matters, he said, are too sensitive for public discussion. The oldest excuse in the book. And the surest sign that there's something to hide. Badenoch didn't even look up from her notes. Her voice stayed measured as she said, "The only thing that's too sensitive here is the truth." The chamber erupted again. She didn't need to shout, she just needed to keep talking. Because at that point, every word from her mouth was feeding a narrative that the government could never control again. She laid it out with surgical calm. The government claimed the evidence was insufficient. But MI5 said otherwise. The CPS claimed they had no reason to drop the case, but the decision came from higher up. And now, conveniently, every official involved had forgotten who attended which meeting. How, she asked, does an entire government forget a national security meeting? The question hung in the air like a charge. You could almost see the weight of it pressing down on every person in the room. Then came the dagger twist. Badenoch revealed that one of the civil servants involved in the case had quietly resigned 2 weeks before the story broke. No public explanation, no farewell statement, just vanished. The Prime Minister's aides exchanged nervous looks. The opposition benches were whispering furiously this wasn't just scandal, it was evidence of rot. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Badenoch, sensing her advantage, slowed her pace deliberately. Every sentence landed with precision. Either this government is incompetent beyond belief, Or someone in this building decided that justice should take a backseat to politics. The Prime Minister stayed silent. Even his usual defenders didn't leap to his rescue. Because there comes a point in every scandal where denial becomes more dangerous than confession. And then she delivered the line that would dominate every headline and every clip shared online that night. When national security becomes negotiable, so does sovereignty. It was short, sharp, and devastating. You could feel the collective exhale of everyone who realised this was no longer about one case, it was about trust. The Prime Minister finally tried to recover, muttering about the importance of balance and diplomatic prudence, but it was too late. The damage was done. His words felt hollow against the evidence Badenoch had already laid bare. The story had escaped his control, and no statement could pull it back, because now the question wasn't what collapsed, it was who ordered it to collapse. And as every journalist in Britain began digging through their sources, one name kept appearing in whispers and leaks. A name that would drag this scandal out of the shadows and straight into Downing Street.